Hello, welcome back. My name is Trish. I work at Schumacher Racing and I help everyone in the team when I can, if I can, and the best that I can with setup and driving and all these different things. And I've enjoyed helping you all over the past number of years I've been working at Schumacher Racing. And a video that I've been asked for a lot is for me to do a four-wheel drive setup video. This would be aimed at our L1, but if you don't have a Schumacher L1, then you could be setting up your car the same. The cars are very similar in geometry nowadays, so then you can look at the same areas and make a judgment for yourself, as well as try these things. So have a watch, see what you think, and then we can go from there. Hopefully you enjoy what you see. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Okay, then you've got the like with the big thumbs up, and leave me a comment. Leave me a comment to let me know what you'd like to see in other videos. I can't think of every question that people have, but I react with these videos thinking what people might want to know, as well as what they've already asked me. Anyway, take a seat, enjoy yourself, and let's go through all the bits and bobs. So this video will be in two parts. Maybe it will become 3 parts if I've missed some things, but I'm aiming to cover the subjects of. We have hexes, so your wheel hexes to adjust the width of your car, as well as your offsets. Axle heights, which is your axle height relative to the lower hinge pin. We can talk about that. Then you have the diff heights. Again, we've got the heights of the diff within the gearboxes, oils in those diffs, as well as shocks and the shock positions. So let's go through all the details. First of all, hexes. Hexes, an interesting subject. People relate a lot of the time hexes to track width. So we've got the hexes on the back of the L1 Evo here and the front of the L1 Evo. Let's start at the front. Front's the best thing to talk about. When you think about track width, we think more stability sometimes. When you add more to it, the car's can be wider, it can support itself when it goes around a corner. Well, that would make sense, but you forget that there is also an offset. The larger this hex, the bigger the offset. Okay, so let's imagine your wheel was tucked in here and your offset was, let's call it 0. We go around a corner and the wheel does this. There's a lot of stability there, but you're not going to generate a lot of steering, which is good for some circumstances. When we were at the Worlds, we wanted to smooth the front end of the car out a little bit, so we actually went to our minus 0.75 hexes on the front. Never gone that narrow before, but it made a big difference. It allowed us to get on the steering going into the corner without it being edgy. Whereas sometimes when we're on AstroTurf, when we want the front to really grab, we increase that hex distance to the 0.75s from 0 where we normally are, or even to the 1.5, but that's very aggressive. What's happening now is the wheel is moving further away, and so it's swinging, it's really grabbing at the corner, and you're going to get a greater feel from the car. But with the add-on that it's going to be a little bit twitchy. Whereas if we adjust it on the front hinge pin distance and we go wider, that will be increasing your track width. It will be changing those relationships, but it's more of a subtle change when you do this, and you won't be changing your offset. So you can increase the track width of the car that way, make it a bit easier to drive. You'll lose a little bit of your entry steering when you go into the corner, but generally you'll be doing it because you want more stability. So that's that with hexes on the front. Hexes on the rear, it's much more simple, but this is still an offset. If you take a look at the back of this, we have our hinge pin, and then we have the face of the hex. The further that point is away, the more that you get through camber change, the wheel trying to literally lift the car up when the car's going through roll. So the bigger that gap is, the more it will stiffen up the car, because the car naturally doesn't want to roll that far. So if it's nice and narrow, it will roll nice and easy, and what you'll find is you get more side bite when it's more of a, let's call it a 0 offset. And the more you increase that offset, literally it will make the car drive forward a lot better, but you won't gain side bite from it. But what you might gain is the feeling of more drive through a turn. So if your rear end is coming out, going wider, allow the rear end to push through that corner so you can drive out of the drift. Okay, it's nice and simple on that one. The other thing you can look at is if you need more power steering. We generally like a car to roll a bit more on the rear if you want more on power steering. And that's where your let's go towards the zero offsets will help you. Whereas if you want to have just more initial, again because of the stiffening action of this greater offset, you'll have a wider hex making you have more initial steering, but you get your drive. So let's go with the case where you get more initial steering, more drive, wider, but when you go narrow, you'll gain more on power steering and side bite. That's the two kind of things that you can cross over. Whereas when you're on carpet, you don't have to worry about side bite in forward drive. If your tyres are wearing out, maybe you'd have to consider that a little bit more. But if you're on carpet, you'd be aiming for, I've got too much steering coming out the corner. It's one thing we dealt with in Dawn at the last EOS, and what we found was going to a slightly wider hex that gave us the drive out the corner that stopped the rear over, like really dipping down at the back, made the car drive straight, so you don't get a strange oversteer coming out the corner. So that's a nice tool, and all it is spacing it. So maybe look away from the whole just track width side of things, but look at what the offsets are doing and how they're making the rear end work. Let's move on to the next thing. Axle heights. On the front of the car, we've got the ability to raise and lower this axle. Some people may say you can't raise and lower the axle, but yes, if the wheel's on, it can't go anywhere, so you'll be changing the wishbone height. But let's just look at it as if it's on the stand, and we're going to move the axle relative to where the wishbone is. When we go lower on the two-wheel drive buggies, we generally get more steering. We don't gain more initial or just more on power. It's just generally more steering. But what we find on the four-wheel drive, because it has a driven axle, so these wheels go around under the power of the car, and what we get with the driven axle is the more we raise that axle, we get on power steering. It overloads the front, it has a lot of grip over the front on power, but off power it's smooth going in. It's a bit like when you do caster change, which we don't play with too much. We can normally sit around the 8-degree mark, but we'll talk about that in a second. We're just going to add that one in. We didn't say we would, but we will. But when we have the axle higher, we get more on power, and when we have it lower, we get more initial. And what we find is by gaining more initial, when we come out of corners, the car is smoother. It's like going to the 8-degree yoke. So you go into the corner, nice steering going in, and then it pushes mid to exit, which is quite a nice feeling sometimes from a four-wheel drive. You don't want oversteering come out the corner, otherwise you're back on off the steering wheel quite a lot. So that's that. The yokes is the same kind of theory, but in a different way. What we find is when we go to an 8-degree, we get more initial, come out the corner, it's nice and square coming out, good drive. But when we go to a 12-degree, you get a lot more steering on power. But what you'll notice sometimes is the rear end has a tendency to kind of float out, and you just lose control of the rear. And because the front's overpowering the rear, but you think normally that the rear hasn't got enough grip, but sometimes the front's doing too much. So axle low, 8 degrees is a really nice way of getting forward drive on these surfaces. Even on carpet, it's a nice positive feeling coming out square out of that corner. So that's those. Then we have diff heights. Okay, we talked about this on the Evo Driveline video that I put out. But if you haven't watched that, because you might not have an L1 Evo, but you might have diff height adjustability, you'll see that lowering the front up and down and the rear up and down can make a difference to the car. We generally live on the high position on the rear on the four-wheel drive. When we drop it down to the low, we find that we get more, just generally more on power grip when the surface grip is really low. It lets the rear move and naturally generate some traction. Sometimes we're in those circumstances where we have to soften things up in certain places to give us that grip. On the front, when we lower it, we find that we get more power, just grip coming out the corners, as well as we get more steering. Let's say as you're going in the front end, because there's less bind and movement from those drive shafts within those slots, you'll find that the front's moving a bit more. You get more steering as you go into the corner, and you felt it hook up nicely. You get to mid-corner steering, you've got enough positioning out the car now, and then you can get back on out the corner and drive straight out. What we do sometimes is when it's too twitchy on the front, we do raise the diff. It can actually reduce that aggressive feeling as you go into corners. Whereas on the rear, we raise it up generally for carpet and AstroTurf and most surfaces normally, because it supports the rear really nicely. And on-off power, you'll find that it helps dictate to the car what it's doing. It's quite a brilliant tool to play with. Next thing to talk about is looking at my list. we have the oils in the diffs. Again, I talked about this on the Evo Driveline video. Check it out if you want, if you've missed some bits on it. But you have the starting oil that you would ever be on from the kit, and you would look at ours, and we have generally 10k in the diff. That's 10,000 CST oil, and that would be our starting point. And generally we go to 2 gears, and 2 gears gives us more drive on power because you get the locking, everything's working in efficiently, and off power it's completely free, and freer than when you have the 4. The actual viscosity of the oil working through the gears is effectively halved because you only have half the gears. It allows things to move nice and easily. On the rear and the front, we always share the same oil. If you want to mess around with different oils front and rear, you can try that. But generally, if you want more drive, we increase all of them. If you want to get more rotation out of the car, you decrease all of them. If you want the car to be more stable on and off power, and you find it's rotating too much and it's a bit too random off power, then go back to the 4 gear, but leaving it with 10k. We generally run 7k on the carpet surfaces, run 10k if it's a looser carpet, and when we get to AstroTurf, we play between 10 and 12. You might find that some tracks are just too twitchy going in because you've got a front tyre that's too aggressive, and that's where you can actually increase the front diff oil. That helps smooth that front end out. At the Japanese Worlds a number of years ago, we had our K2 vehicle going around, and I had some difficulty getting Michael's car to stop loading up that front quarter on certain corners. And I don't like to change a car just for certain corners, but he could afford to have less steering. So I actually put 30k in the front diff, and I think we had 10 in the rear, something around that. Might have been about 15, who knows? I'd have to check an old setup sheet out. Anyway, that helped it out a lot, and it meant that you can lean on the front end into the corners. But that's more for those circumstances where it's actually quite tricky. So anyway, the other bit to talk about, we have shocks and their positions. It's quite simple. If you go with the kit settings and then go from there, don't change too far. Generally most kit settings are where the team have found for them to work the best. On my car, we see here, I have the inside hole on the front tower and the middle hole on the wishbone, and that generally gives me this kind of position that I live on most of the time. And when I want to help things, I widen out these 2 positions, so I go to the next hole out just to support it. Don't change it much more from there. Sometimes with Yawn and some of the team, we've gone to the inside hole in the front arm, but we've gone up on the spring rate. That lets the front end dip down in the corner and get a bit more softness out of the car, but you will have to think about thickening up your shock oil. On the rear, we generally run the middle hole on the rear arm, and I'm currently on the 2nd from the inside, but we go up to the 3rd sometimes just to support that rear end in the corner. What you'll find is if the car's dipping on that quarter, whichever one it is, it could be that these shocks are too far laid over on that area, so you just need to stand them back up. But only go 1 hole at a time. Have a feel. If that didn't help it, maybe you need to be playing with your roll bars, but we'll be talking about roll bars on the next video. For the shocks, check out our setups that are on the website, but the 2-hole piston setup is what we use on carpet. We use 1.8 on the rear, 1.6 on the front, and then maybe 550, 400. And then if we have to, if the surface is really grippy or it's a bit warmer, we do go up on the oil sometimes, but sometimes it's the wrong thing to do going up the oil because it doesn't let the car roll. Instead, it kind of lifts up like a skateboard and flips over. Not very good. So that's where sometimes you've got to be really careful with what you're doing there. Whereas on the AstroTurf, we've actually got a big hole set up, so we go to larger holes, 2.1 on the rear, 1.8 on the front, with stiffer oils in there, so you could be around the 450 rear and then 650 front, that kind of area. And that'll be for these bumpy AstroTurf tracks. But that's what we do with our cars. Other people do other things, but we found that to be very helpful for our racing that we've been doing. When we went to Trenton at the Hoodie World Championships back last year in September, I think it's September, a little while ago now, we had the same as our Astro setup, which worked really, really well. We could have maybe finished a bit higher with a little bit more work on setup, but we can always try harder next time. That covers the first part. Check out the 2nd video and enjoy. See you soon. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, the like, do that one. Leave me a comment like I said before, and even click on that bell if you don't want to miss future videos because you're not always on here. Click on that bell. See you soon, look after yourselves.